Wendell Ferreira says, first, love the work that you do. Second, I find it funny that when you guys mention Mike McCarthy, it's usually in a bad, critical way. Well, there's a much more positive vibe around Sean Payton. It's not just you. It looks to be a general perception. While I understand Payton is probably a better offensive play caller and designer, their results as head coaches are relatively similar. Similar winning percentage, McCarthy has more playoff appearances and wins, and the same amount of Super Bowl rings. McCarthy has a perception of his tenure in Green Bay affected by Aaron Rodgers, but Payton also had a future Hall of Famer as his quarterback in New Orleans. And while Drew Brees wasn't as good without Payton in San Diego, Rodgers' 2005 preseason highlights are so far from what he put on the field after the McCarthy QB school, which was a real thing. And now in Dallas, McCarthy has had two 12-win seasons after the Cowboys had two 12-win seasons between 2008 and 2019. Genuinely curious to understand why you think Sean Payton's narrative is much more positive, in which areas you think he's better than McCarthy. It's a good question. Yes. I have answers, but it's a good question.
Yeah. It's hard to overcome some stigmas. I think, and some of those stick. I mean, my first thought of Mike McCarthy, and whether this is fair or not, is when he threw the challenge flag and Jordy Nelson ran on the field and grabbed it. Do you remember that game? Yeah. But those are in my head. Or
the decisions in the NFC Championship game against the Seahawks and
yes.
the conservative moments that kind of led to some real pain.
I would say last year was his best game management performance as a head coach, which is, number one thing if you're not calling plays, but he's calling plays now. Or last year was when I believe they're playing the Eagles on Sunday or Monday night, but a night game. They're kind of like, this was in 2021, really kind of blowing through him, like could have really put him out by halftime. There's like a minute and a half to go, minute 20 to go, and he didn't burn a timeout. And the Eagles were about to punt. But like certain things like that, that's really hard to like get out of my head because it's like, it's happened. It's not like, again, this is not just ideas or, what we think of the guy. These are things, tangible things that the head coach can affect. I will say this too, is that he has been a bit of a joke. There should be respect given to what he did do, especially last year when Dak was out, and how the Cowboys keep winning games. They do, maybe not at those times the last couple of years, the best rosters, and he really did maximize a lot of it. And there should be some credit to that, but I don't know. There's just the McCarthy QB school was really, to me, it was just, he just had Tedford. Aaron Rodgers came out with the Jeff Tedford, like shoulder rack thing where he had the ball high and he just dropped it down. Like, to me, because if you watch those old Cal highlights, it's like, oh, there was some zip there. There's some plenty arm with Aaron Rodgers there. That's why he was a first round pick. So those things are just hard to get out of my head. I have more to this, but I think those are just the initial thoughts. And he is a genuine solid coach and seems like a good guy, and his players do like him. But it's just some of those stigmas are really hard to get out of my brain.
For most of his career in Green Bay, or most of his tenure in Green Bay, they were winning 10, 11 games a season and going to the playoffs, and they had top 10 offenses. But the fall off that Mike McCarthy had with his Hall of Fame quarterback, still able to play at a very high level, which we saw in the couple of years under LaFleur, that never happened with Sean Payton. So Sean Payton with Drew Brees in New Orleans, from their first 14 seasons together, they finished in the top 10 in offensive DVOA 12 times in 14 seasons.
Yeah.
The other 2 years, they were 11th and 12th.
Yeah.
Okay. And so
always had an above average offense.
Always.
Period. Done.
Always. The 3, 7, and 9 seasons that they had, that stretch where they weren't making the playoffs, they were 32nd, and 27th in EPA per play on defense.
Yeah. The defenses are awful.
They're awful. Historically bad.
So much fun to go against, by the way, for teams going against them.
They were unbelievably bad. Unbelievably bad. Okay. And as the head coach, you are tasked with trying to give yourself a defensive coordinator that doesn't allow that to happen. So you can criticize him there. And the same thing goes for the Cowboys' success being driven a lot by what their defense has been over the last couple seasons. You have to give Mike McCarthy credit for moving on from Mike Nolan and going to get a guy like Dan Quinn. But I think purely from like the offensive play caller and offensive design standpoint, Sean Payton's really never lost the juice. In 2021, which is the year where they finished in the bottom half of the league, bottom third of the league in like EPA per play on offense, they were 9th in EPA per dropback when Jameis was playing quarterback. If Jameis stays healthy that year, they're probably like a top 12 offense. Teddy was 16th in EPA per dropback during his time in 2019 when Brees got hurt. They've gotten good results out of their backup quarterbacks when those backup quarterbacks have played. It's only when they've had to go further down the line for 1 year that the offense was below average. So I just think that tail end, just slant flat set of jokes about Mike McCarthy during the end in Green Bay, that to me is a lot of like the stink on Mike McCarthy, is that it didn't end well. And he hasn't been the architect of the offense since then. So we haven't really had reason to say, okay, like he's learned from his mistakes. He's bounced back in a way that somebody like Dan Quinn has. So this year, I think is going to go a very, very long way in how we think about, talk about, consider Mike McCarthy.
Yeah, that's what's hard. It's hard to get those last few years out because what the Packers were doing at the turn of the aughts, so 2010-ish, I'll just say that it was a sort of phrase anyone's ever used, but turn at the start of the new decade was, everybody was running cover 2, and what they were doing was a lot of stuff that beat cover 2, and it was great and it's fantastic and really mattered because that was the meta at the time. And it just seemed that they never adapted. They never took that next step with the offense. They kind of just stayed the same. And that's where the joke from the slant flats comes from. And even the offense by the end, for better or for worse, was mainly, it was kind of a lot of Rodgers going rogue. And like, you can say that, oh, that's Rodgers and everything, but that's still on the head coach because you got to communicate it and like get him to buy in, much like LaFleur did. LaFleur got that buy-in. You've mentioned it several times, how the first year was growing pains together, and then he got him to buy in or just compromise on some things. And that's on the coaches. I mean, whether it's fair or not, you have to get the players to buy in. And I remember hearing from a coach there with the Packers was that they couldn't. Yeah, I'll tell the story. Screw it. They were hearing from a coach there, and he said by the last year there, the last 2 years there, Rodgers was signaling to the receivers, and they truly had no idea what he was signaling because Rodgers was just making it up with his players, like just going like, hey, this is a signal this week, yada yada, which has become a thing because there's articles written about that.
Yeah, Kalen wrote one.
Yeah, Kalen wrote one, but it's like that's kind of weird to hear about an NFL freaking offense where the coaches said, because they would call the play and he would do his signals, and as me as a quality control coach, I could relate to this. What did he just check to? If usually and they had no idea, but that's just speaks to what the end day Packers like offense was like. It was a lot of that. So, and then, and the credit to Sean Payton is that all those points you just brought up, I was going to make similar ones. When Teddy Bridgewater or Taysom Hill was a quarterback, it still was a tangible, sound offense that adapted, and you could just feel his fingerprints on everything. And that just speaks to him as an offensive mind. That's why I give him so much credit. And also the influence that I know that he has in personnel evaluation. And I think that good and bad, but I think that's why I maybe sometimes give him a lot of credit because he, to me, is just a true offensive mind that I could see his tangible work week in, week out with Drew Brees and without him.